Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of our ReSES ID seminar. Today we will have Katrin Herfeld on the progress in economics, and our discussant will be Uskali Mäki. This seminar is a part of our project called Rethinking the Serviceability of Economics to Society, which is funded by the Finnish Cultural Foundation. This project is the public phase of our research project called Economics as Serviceable Social Knowledge, which is funded by the Academy of Finland. Our main speaker today is Katrin Herfeld. She's a professor of history and philosophy of economics at the University of Hannover in Germany. Her research interests fall into the fields of philosophy of the social sciences, history of economics, and philosophy of economics. Katrin has recently received an ERC starting grant for a project entitled Model Transfer and Its Challenges in Science, the Case of Economics, which allows her to conceptually and empirically study why and how models are transferred across different scientific domains and what such model transfers imply for our understanding of scientific progress. Our discussant today is Uskali Mäki, who is a professor emeritus at the University of Helsinki. He is the leader of TINT Center for Philosophy of Social Science. He was the director of TINT Center of Excellence between 2012 and 2017. Previously, before Helsinki, and between 1995 and 2006, he was a professor at Erasmus University Rotterdam, where he was the academic director of Erasmus Institute for Philosophy and Economics, EIPE. He was a co-editor of the Journal of Economic Methodology between 1996 and 2005, founding member, executive board member, and between 2017 and 2008, chair of the International Network for Economic Method, INEM. And he has been a research area coordinator for the European Association for Evolutionary Political Economy since 1992. Before we start, I should note that the seminar will be recorded. However, we will stop the recording after Katrin's talk and Uskali's comments so that we can have a more relaxed discussion. So thanks everyone for being a part of our seminar, and particularly thanks to our speaker Katrin and discussant Uskali. Thanks very much for agreeing to contribute to our seminar series. Katrin, thanks very much, and the floor is yours.
So, do you see the slides all right?
Yes, we do.
Great. Yes, so thank you very much for this invitation, for this kind of invitation. I'm very glad that I'm here, being able to present something about progress in economics. What I present mainly is work in progress with Marcel Baumans from the University of Utrecht University, and we have recently finished a very first paper on this topic. It's a book chapter which is published in Yafen Chan's edited volume on scientific progress, which is entitled New Philosophical Perspectives on Scientific Progress, and it has just come out, I think, with Routledge. And although this paper is published, for me, this is certainly work in progress in the sense that I'm only starting to look into this topic, mainly, as Emra mentioned, in the context of my starting grant, where I look into model transfers in science and to look into the question of how model transfers in economics mainly can be considered progressive. And the other part for why this is work in progress for me, especially, is that the case study that I'm going to present today is a case study in history of econometrics, and there Marcel, of course, is the expert. So what I'm going to do, just to give you a little bit of context, What I'm going to do in the future is take these rough ideas that I'm going to present today to you on progress in economics and try to apply them to different cases, different other cases in the history of economics, but also in contemporary economics, to also understand the ways in which these reapplications or model transfers across disciplines are progressive. And I think that's important. It's an important background to know, just to understand the kind of approach that we are taking to the topic. So I'm going to, I very much look forward to the discussion afterwards, and of course to the comments of Uskali. So the starting point today is first the observation when you look into the literature that there is, of course, a lot of research in general philosophy of science that has been discussing scientific progress. When you compare this with philosophy of economics literature discussing progress, you see that comparably philosophers of economics have not that much engaged with the question of whether economics is progressive, and if so, when progress in economics actually occurs. And if you find such discussions, most of them have focused mainly on the assessment of theoretical achievement in economics. So on questions around theory choice, rational theory choice, and theory change, and thereby mainly committing to the idea when discussing progress that progress in economics occurs when economic theories approximate the truth about the economy. So there is an underlying notion of progress here that has been dominating the literature and philosophy of economics. And those discussions can, of course, mainly be considered alongside the more general debates in philosophy of science about progress that have been taking place in the 20th century that were very much dominated by Popper, Lakatos, Loudon, and others, who in general focused very much on the role of scientific theories in progress and pushing progress in science. And in this paper, we don't want to dismiss those discussions. Of course, progress can be theoretical in this way. And we have a lot of work in economics about, further developing economic theory. We, however, think that such theoretical progress is not any longer what economists mainly aim to achieve in economics. And we think, and you can see this also when you read economists talking about progress, that there is or has been for a very, very long time, maybe even since Adam Smith, you would want to say, has been this unchanged or almost unchanged theoretical core in economics, which is enshrined ultimately in utility theory and its variants, if you want to include prospect theory as a similar, in going into a conceptually similar direction. And this core has not really been changed, and it does not seem to be the long-term goal to replace this, theoretical framework by any other in economics. So there seems to be some kind of consensus, at least among mainstream economics, that theory is not the thing that we want to develop further as a priority, let's put it that way. Rather, when we look into economic practices, and of course, many philosophers of economics have argued for this and have also shown this when looking into the history of economics, we can clearly see that the main activity consists in using models, normally mathematical models, and oftentimes, as also Morgan and Morrison have argued, those models are used as a way of, as a form of instrumentation that mediate between the theory, the economic theory, and the world. But those models have an autonomous status and thereby cannot, be equaled with economic theory. So they are different in that they have a very different role to play. And those practices, of course, they are not new, and many people have discussed them, but they have become so extensive in economics in recent decades that we think that thinking about progress in economics, we should consider that this is the main thing that economists are doing, using those models as mediators. So our goal in this paper is to make sense of this these kind of ongoing modeling practices and think about ways in which we can think of those practices as being progressive in economics. And more specifically, we want to discuss how progress in economic models in economics occurs via using those mathematical models, not only by using them, but also building them and reapplying them within economics, but also across economics. And the idea behind that is that mathematical models in economics are most of the time used for targeting very specific purposes. The underlying idea that we also want to accept, I'm not going to discuss this any further, but just to have this in mind, is that we think that thereby, by thinking about what economists are doing with mathematical models, they take the validation of mathematical models through observing how well they fit the purposes that economists are applying them for. So that's the underlying, or the activity that we want to characterize further in terms of a notion of progress that we think might be conducive. So against this background, the general question that I will pose in this talk is, when does progress in economics as a model-based discipline occur? And the goal really is to defend an account of progress that is grounded in economic practices. That means that captures this idea of economists using mathematical models in this kind of instrumental way. And the claim that I would like to defend, and that we also defend in this paper that I mentioned, is that progress in economics is functional. And this means that it is functional through the successful reuse and use of so-called model templates. And I'm going to, develop in this talk what I mean by successful here, what I mean by model templates, and so forth. And you can break this claim down further into two subclaims, if you will, or two statements that I try to support. Namely, first, progress in economics occurs in case a model is considered sufficiently useful for being applied or reapplied to not only solve pending or new problems, but also define them. And at the same time, progress in economics can be disrupted when models are considered useless for problems. But then progress might advance, or economics might advance again progressively when a new model is developed and applied that proves useful. So all of those terminological aspects I will try to develop further as we go along in this talk. So the agenda for the talk will be then to, in order to make this proposal, is that I will very quickly look into one of the most recent proposals for progress in economics by Anna Alexandrova and Robert Northcott, to then introduce what has been called the new functionalist account of scientific progress, that I think will be fruitful for thinking more generally about progress in model-based economics. And then the rest of the talk, I will try to make more explicit how this general account of functional progress could be worked out. And we did so in the paper by drawing on the so-called template account of scientific models that helps us to make more explicit and concrete what it means for models to be used and reused in economics in a progressive way. And in order to support this proposal further, I looked into a case study from the history of econometrics and discuss which lessons we can draw from this case, from this particular case, to think about progress or functional progress in economics before I conclude. So Before we go into the recent discussions about progress in economics, or the little discussion that has taken place in philosophy of economics, I would like to quickly mention the 4 accounts of progress that have been developed in recent general philosophy of science, to then see which account has mostly been applied in or discussed in economics. The first account, and you might all know this, is the epistemic account that defines progress in terms of knowledge. And here the idea is that an episode of the history of science is progressive. It shows the accumulation of scientific knowledge. And that's an account that has not yet, as far as I know, been discussed by many philosophers of economics in terms of how it would be fruitful to think about progress in economics. And it has various problems on its own that I'm not going to discuss, but nevertheless, I would like to mention it here just for, just to have it in mind. Maybe it comes up in the discussion. And second, the further proposal is the so-called noetic account, which Finno Delson has developed recently, which formulates the idea that science progresses when it enhances our understanding about the world. Of course, you might know that there's a lot of discussion about what understanding really is, what it amounts to, and so forth. And that's also not an account that I'm going to discuss here, and that to my knowledge, has also not been discussed as very prominently in philosophy of economics. What has been mostly discussed in philosophy of economics is, as I mentioned before, the so-called semantic account of progress. And here, the idea is that science progresses in the moment where it shows either the accumulation of true scientific beliefs, or it increases, or it shows an increasing approximation towards true scientific beliefs. So the idea being that science progresses in the moment where it approaches truth truths about the world. And Popper is probably the most famous representative of this account. And that's an account that has been taken up a lot by philosophers of economics, mainly also because here the notion of progress is defined in terms of theory change or rational theory choice. And then lastly, there is the functional internalist account of progress, which I would like to make popular, which construes progress in terms of the functions of science. And according to this account, an episode of the history of science is progressive if it shows the success of the fulfillment of certain functions. So for instance, the function of problem solving, where the fulfillment of the function is judged by the scientists themselves. So this is why it's called an internalist account. Scientists themselves judge whether those functions that they set themselves are successfully fulfilled. And here defenders are Thomas Kuhn and Larry Lawden and others. So most of the discussions have centered around the semantic account when it comes to at least that's my sense, when it comes to philosophy of economics. And 2 philosophers that have criticized this semantic account in economics are Anna Alexandra and Robert Northcott, and they raise 3 points against the applicability of this account in economics, and I largely agree with them. And first, they stress that it has been, of course, shown in the literature that it is impossible to give a satisfactory account of verisimilitude. That refers to the idea of Popper, thinking about how we can think about science approaching the truth. And it's very hard to actually capture what that really means philosophically. And so we can't really on this basis take this as a criterion for theory choice. And furthermore, of course, we know, and this is what I would add to their account, is that verisimilitude is of course not the only criterion for theory choice in science, and thereby we could call it not the most useful criterion when we think about progress in science, because we have other criteria. As we know from Kuhn, we have epistemic virtues. Theories can be chosen because they are particularly simple, because they make predictions and so forth. and nor does the criterion of verisimilitude guarantee the choice of the most useful theory. I mean, we know this from Einstein's theory, which when it's compared to Newton's theory, that the latter, of course, is oftentimes much more useful to apply, whereas the other one, Einstein's one, we would consider to probably approximate the truth better. And second, even, and that's the point that Alexandrova and Northcott are making, even if we consider the fact that economics is a model-based discipline and leave this idea of theories approaching the truth, what they argue is that the most economic models are so idealized that they are therefore very far away from even approximating the truth. So this idea that the semantic account presupposes that we approximate the truth is really something unfeasible in economics, and it doesn't hold up against what we observe what economists are actually doing. And third, even if we accept an account of models, for instance, such as the isolationist account of models by Uskali, they argue that a search for truth of economic models is not only challenging, of course, but it might also neither be necessary for economics. We might not even care about the truth, nor is it often wanted by economics. That's also an argument from economic practice. And therefore, it's really hard to locate a search for truth in most contemporary economic practices. And I tend to agree with them and with their critical attitude towards the usefulness of the semantic account. Although, you know, we can discuss this later on, whether economists are never concerned with truth. There might be sometimes, but it's not the only and most prominent activity, I think, that they are engaged in. So they propose their own account, and they bring up an alternative proposal, which they call an account on the basis of a notion of engineering process. And they, in order to push this account, or characterize this account, they claim that economic progresses not through theory development, but through what they call an engineering know-how, which they think is a skill of applying economic theory to a problem in a specific context. So rather than developing a theory further, it's developing the skill to apply that theory. And they take the example which they discuss from game theory, namely the case of game theoretic models being applied to the spectrum auctions. And this type of progress is, according to them, very context specific, because of course it targets a skill set in order to apply a model to a concrete problem. And this means that the kind of knowledge produced is very limited in exporting that knowledge to new contexts. So to my understanding, that notion of progress is not necessarily cumulative either. However, they presuppose, in order to make this notion prominent, they presuppose theoretical progress in that and that their notion of engineering progress presupposes the existence of theoretical knowledge that is enshrined in economic models. And those models then become applied. But theory is progressive only insofar as it generates useful new aids to the engineers. So I see three challenges with this account, although I agree with some of the issues that they raise. First, an open question is, of course, whether we should consider theoretical developments per se as not being progressive, if they are not helping us to, target some, or if they are not instrumental to address some kind of engineering problem. The second aspect that I would like to highlight is that, of course, not every problem in economics is an engineering problem, such as the case of spectrum auctions. There might be conceptual problems, there might be, empirical problems, there might be all sorts of other problems that come up in economics that are not captured by this idea of engineering problem. And third, the strong concern for problems in economics is good, which I think they highlight. However, some of those problems change, of course, over time, and then while we try to understand or address them in economics, the ways in which we address them might also influence back on the practices, the methods, and the tools in economics. And this by itself can be progressive. So that means that the change of problems can lead to conceptual changes in economics, can lead to theoretical changes, changes in modeling practices, and so forth. That by itself could be considered progressive. And so it's not a one-way street. This idea of the idea of progress in economics should not be seen as a one-way street, I think, from modeling or using theories and models to then solve the engineering problem, but also it comes back to how we define those problems and what kind of methods we are going to use. So to capture the nature of progress in model-based economics, I think it would be fruitful to apply a different kind of account of progress, namely the new functional account of progress, as it is, and this is or as it has been called in that way by Yafeng Shang. He has formulated this this account of progress recently, and it builds upon this functional internal list account of progress that I mentioned before, grounded in Kuhn and others. And on this view, science progressive if more useful research problems and their corresponding solutions are proposed. And I think one major advantage of Shan's account over traditional functional approaches is that instead of emphasizing only the problem solution, he only stresses the definition of problems. And this is how this element of feeding back from problem addressing to changing the kinds of methodologies we use for addressing these new problems, what I just mentioned as a criticism of Alexandra Northcott, can be built into this account. And furthermore, his account commits to a very broad notion of a problem that includes engineering problems, but it also includes problems like causal hypothesis formulation, theory development, and other conceptual elements or conceptual developments. And the way in which we can think about, the different kinds of problems that economic practice entails in such a broad way allows us for those developments to also be considered progressive. Other aspects that could also fall under this category is, of course, model construction processes can be considered a problem, but in also model transfer, as I mentioned before, the things that I'm interested in. And these advantages of his account become clear when you consider what he thinks science is doing. On the one hand, what science is doing when it is progressive. On the one hand, science is progressive when it defines or refines an old or new problem. And the activities that he describes are activities like problem proposing, problem refinement, and problem specification, always in exchange with the kinds of methodologies that we have available. And second, science is progressive when it provides a solution to an existing or a newly defined problem. And so in order to make this more clear, Shan develops this idea of a common recipe that is, you can think about this as a general conceptual framework and set of activities that we use for problem solving, which is based on a series of, as such, of intertwined activities of also experimentation, problem refinement, conceptualization, hypothesizing, and reasoning. Of course, that's really broad, but the idea here being that we use a set of ingredients and we combine them in different ways, but we oftentimes use a similar set of ingredients in order to solve different kinds of problems that come up in science. So one key aspect of this account is an emphasis on what Shan calls usefulness of problem definitions and problem solutions. So only when we give useful definitions and solutions, science is progressive. And how does he define it? Both definitions and solutions are useful when a practice that addresses those problems can be repeated. So it can be the process that is characterized by these activities that I just mentioned can be repeatedly used by other scientists, and thereby the result can be replicable or is replicable to some degree. And second, this solution or this common recipe has to provide a reliable framework that is also reapplicable. So not only should other scientists be able to repeat it, but also they should be able to reapply to many different kinds of problems. And the more problems are solved and generated, the better that is. Now, how is this repeatability and reapplicability ensured? And this is, and I just want to highlight this particularly, although I mentioned it already, this is introduced by his notion of a common recipe. So scientists, of course, always solve problems in different ways. And to capture the idea of a common recipe, he identifies a set of components and activities, as I just mentioned, that are often present in a problem solution and a problem definition, but they are not exclusive, and you might even change them around. So it's a recipe that is to some degree flexible. So the way in which he characterizes this is a solution to a research problem usually consists of the following components: a vocabulary, which is a set of the concepts employed in the problems and solutions, a set of practical guides which specify all the procedures and methodology as means to solve the problems, a set of hypotheses which are proposed to solve the problems, and a set of patterns of reasoning which indicate how to use other components to solve the problems. And here, just as an aside, because that's important for us, hypotheses, of course, can be theoretical statements, but also they can be more generally understood as models, as Shan makes very clear. So these are the main ingredients of this functional account of progress. And of course, that seems very abstract, and we can think about scientific progress in general along these lines, but it's hard to, or at least for us, it was a bit hard to actually see how we can concretely apply this to economics and how we can make this very abstract account of common recipe based science to make it more concrete to apply to model-based economics and think about progress in economics. So what we try to do is to make these elements of a common recipe and problem definition and solution more specific by drawing on the so-called template account. We wanted to capture not only the function of economic models as representations, but also we wanted to go, as I mentioned before, beyond the representational role of economic models and see how we can think about them more flexibly when we see how economists use them when they define and solve new problems. And what we propose is to think about these common recipes in terms of Paul Humphreys' template account of scientific models. And on this account, models can ultimately be thought of as consisting of what Humphrey calls templates. And he has various notions of templates that he specifies as he goes, and depending on what kind of disciplines he looks at. But the basic idea is that those templates are fairly general. These are usually, mathematical or computational structures that first come without any specific interpretation. And as such, they are subject independent. They can be thereby given all sorts of interpretations that we want. But first of all, they are not tied to any discipline or set of target systems. And then they can be used to describe very general relationships between sets of variables. Sometimes they occur within a theory. This is what he calls, when this happens, this is what he calls a theoretical template, but oftentimes they come independent of a scientific theory. And then as they are usually formulated mathematically, they are very general and flexible, and which is good when we think about, these templates constituting these common recipes that Sean has in mind in order to reapply them to multiple problems and change them over time. And they need to be, if they are going to be applied to some kind of problem, they need to be refined and adapted to a specific target domain in order to make them applicable. And Humphreys has a very sophisticated way of explicating this whole process. I'm not going to go into this now. We can go into this in the Q&A, where he thinks of this refinement and adaptation as a model construction process. So we use basically these templates in order to ground models on that basis, or construct new models on that basis that we can then apply and that are tractable. And tractability is another very interesting and good feature for, or attractive feature that explains why these model templates are reapplied across disciplines, but also within a discipline. And the examples are the Loettger-Volterra equations, all sorts of statistical distributions, network models, rational choice models, and so forth. So you might want to think of those kinds of examples as really these general templates that are used in model construction. And I just said that the idea here is, using those templates in the process of model construction. I'm skipping over this now a little bit, but the important point is that the role of templates in economic models, we think, offers a very different understanding of modeling practice that goes beyond the dominant accounts that we have oftentimes in philosophy of economics that take models to be mainly instruments of representation, or models as representation. So one thing that is problematic with Humphreys when it comes to thinking about cases of progressive model reapplication in economics is what Taya Knuuttila and Andrea Loettgers have stressed recently in another paper. And they developed this account of Humphreys further to make it even more applicable and show how we can explain the reapplication of these templates. And they stress that what is missing in Humphreys' account is really the role of analogies. Because if you have this very abstract general template without any kind of interpretation, then it's unclear what exactly it is that helps scientists to see that these templates can be reapplied to structurally similar problems. And they say, well, it is the analogies that are coming with the templates that allow us to reapply those templates. And without stressing this aspect of analogies too much, they say, well, templates usually come, even if they're really abstract, come with an underlying conceptual vision of the general structure of the phenomenon or of the target system, or of the problem, if you will, attached to it. And this conceptual vision of that is somehow existing in the target system to which we want to apply this model, for instance, that this conceptual vision then helps us to actually see that the model is attractive for this particular target system, and helps us then to explain these model reapplication processes. And so the way in which they define then ultimately what they call a model template, which is just a reformulated notion of a Humphreys template notion, is a formal platform for minimal model construction coupled with very general conceptualization without yet any subject-specific interpretation or adjustment. And those are the kinds of things that we think are underlying most of economic models, and that we find this notion fruitful in order to think how, you know, economic models are then reapplied in this form, and thereby contributing to progress in the field. Okay, so to illustrate this kind of this kind of progress, functional progress that we have in mind via the reapplication of these model templates, what we did was we looked at the very first modeling effort in economics, which was the attempt in the 1930s to model the business cycle mechanism. And along that line, other macrodynamic phenomena, such as, for instance, economic growth. And the main protagonist here was Jan Tinbergen. And he could not yet draw on any templates because the model building was not, or I mean, he could have, but there were no templates or models around in economics, at least not that prominent. And he had to come up with his own template. And the mathematical theories that were available at the time were, of course, equilibrium theory and utility theory, but they were not considered suitable for modeling the business cycle just because, of course, equilibrium theory was a non-dynamic theory. The business cycle is a macro phenomenon that is dynamic and also requires not a micro theory, but a macro theory. And so he had to come up with his own template to actually model the business cycle, what he called the business cycle mechanism. And he was therefore in search of a formalism or such kind of template that I just mentioned that could best represent this kind of dynamic behavior. And on our view, Tinbergen proposed exactly this kind of common recipe when he came up with his template that Chan has in mind. That included what Tinbergen called a methodology, but you can think of it as this general template, and included a vision of what the business cycle actually is. And then it also included a number of requirements prescribing how these cyclical movements of the economy should be or could be explained. For Tinbergen, it was also very important, that reminds us also of this notion of a model template. It was very important to distinguish the mathematical form from the mathematical form of the mechanism that he tried to describe, and with this template and the economic interpretation of these equations that he came up with. Because for him, it was really the mathematical form that determined the nature of these possible movements that he saw reflected in the business cycle, and not the economic interpretation per se. And then what he did was he drew on Maxwell's method of formal analogy for arguing that the mathematical form could be this, that he came up with, this template could be reapplied in very different systems that are characterized by the same mathematical relations that he specified there, because they show the same movements in variables, or in economic variables, if you will. So he first found this mathematical form having a specific conceptual vision of the business cycle in mind, and then he provided an economic interpretation of the components of the template, the equations. Okay, so what we propose in this paper is then that besides this economic interpretation that was that he gave to the mathematical equation, Tinbergen's conceptual vision of the business cycle was already expressed in the mathematical equations. That's why we think of it as a model template. And thereupon, the equations needed an economic interpretation to fix how these equation terms represent aspects of the mechanism named on, or you can also understand, he calls it mechanism, but he thought of it as, he thought of this mechanism as basically the economic system. So, and without going into the details, Marcel knows, of course, much more about this than I do. Tinbergen proposed the template that you see here on the slide in form of a general difference differential integral equation. And he did not want to describe the data directly, the data that you see on the illustrated on the left-hand side of the slide, but rather he wanted to describe the behavior of the economic variables that you see on the right-hand side of the slide, which shows the business cycle conceptualized by Tinbergen as a harmonic oscillation. And this conceptual vision then of the business cycle gave him the mathematical forms that then required an interpretation. And then he had, I'm not going into the details now because of time reasons, but then he had, of course, to specify how the different variables behave. He had, he specified how what he called the dynamic element and the cyclical element by giving them also, specific or describing the behavior of these variables in specific ways, such that this conceptual vision was actually captured in this template. Okay. So Tinbergen developed this template with this very clear conceptual vision and of the business cycle, and it also shows how the conceptual vision of this business cycle was coupled with the mathematical structure. And this template was then really taken up and you elaborate upon, generalized mainly by Paul Samuelson that you see here on the slide, and it was reapplied extensively. So Paul Samuelson turned it into a general modeling methodology, really to think about all sorts of problems in macroeconomics, and then later on. There were two main textbooks by Allen and Chian that outlined and illustrated and defended this kind of methodology based on this template that Tinbergen had come up with, that also accepted this conceptual vision of the main characteristics of not only the business cycle, but all sorts of phenomena that you could describe that had a similar structure underlying them, at least when it comes to the conceptual vision that economists had. So they took this to be a model template that could be reapplied, and it was reapplied via these textbooks, of course, and then went through a lot of macroeconomics to then study similar or define and solve similar kinds of problems. And this is the way in which we think that captures this idea of a common recipe. So this case of Tinbergen shows how a template is applied and defined to solve multiple problems and maybe also redefine new problems. But we can also see that the template in this process is not reapplied on its own, but its reuse for these various problems crucially depends on a shared conceptual vision. And if that conceptual vision is questioned, or there are certain considerations that call it or that lead even to its abandonment, then progress might be hampered because these model templates are then not reapplied anymore. And that happened also in this case. This slide just is meant to illustrate how Tinbergen's conceptual vision of the business cycle became fundamentally questioned when Ragnar Frisch thought, and you see this in the picture in the figure in the middle of the slide. Ragnar Frisch came up with a very different conceptual vision of the business cycle that he captured by his concept of impulses. And because the problem that Tinbergen was confronted with was that his model didn't really always describe the business cycle really well. And Ragnar Frisch came up with this concept of impulses to really explain these irregularities that you could also observe in the cycle by the idea of introducing by the idea that there might be erratic shocks that disturb the economic system. And that was something that Tinbergen couldn't address. And so Frisch started to think about a new conceptual vision of the characteristics of the business cycle, and ultimately replaced Tinbergen's model template with a template that combined or that modeled the business cycle by way of, in terms of a stochastic process, and with another model that you might have heard, the rocking horse model that you might have heard of, but it's not important for this presentation. But rather, the idea is that in the moment where the conceptual vision was questioned, and it was further questioned by work by Slutsky and also Fischer, in the moment where this conceptual vision of the business cycle was questioned and revised, Tinbergen's methodology could not be reapplied anymore. And when this questioning of the conceptual vision happened, and there was a whole bunch of literature that was produced in order to address the kinds of problems that Tinbergen couldn't address anymore, that led ultimately to a new set of models and modeling or templates, if you will, that led to the what we now know as the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models. So in terms of the history, that was the result, where the underlying conceptual vision of the business of dynamic processes is very different. So in that sense, if that vision is not shared anymore, that is underlying model templates, progress can be hampered or even halted by not allowing for this reapplicability of those templates anymore. Okay. Unless, and in the moment where scientists agree on a new conceptual vision and can combine this with a new template that is reapplicable, then progress might continue or start again. Let's put it that way. Okay, what does this case study show us in light of what I said before about scientific progress and functional progress in particular? We think that it reveals how model templates are not only used and reused in economics, but also how scientists really initially create models, and how, once they are considered less useful, those kinds of models, because of maybe not a problematic conceptual vision, such templates are oftentimes replaced with new ones, and that can be still progressive. But in the moment where we abandon this conceptual vision, then this might be a problem. The case study also illustrates that it is not only the mathematical structure that is reused, but what is also reused is this shared conceptual vision of the phenomenon that comes with the template together. It also shows that if a vision is no longer shared, that's what I mentioned before, a model template can become useless and can be or has to be replaced. And sometimes this happens against huge resistance. Of course, Tinbergen was resistant against that. And it has to be replaced with a different one in order to for science to progress again. And it thereby underscores how underscores how the concept of a model template might play a key role in enabling functional progress in economics, and thereby also allowing us to think or to support the point that progress in economics can be meaningfully thought of as functional in chance terms. So in light of this case study, to put this more generally, we take away from that progress in model-based economics is often functional, because we take this case to be representative of a lot of modeling practices that take place in economics, and also the way in which model use, model reapplication, model replacement happens over time. And this functional progress manifests in the repeated reapplication of mathematical models that are part of a common recipe used to define and solve old and new problems. The co-creation of the conceptual vision through a formal template, as I mentioned before, Tinbergen first came up with the template and then had a conceptual vision that allowed him to refine or further explicate or further formulate this template more specifically with the business cycle in mind, which enables the template's application to various phenomena with similar characteristics. And the shaping and reshaping of the conceptual vision underlying a mathematical template has to become accepted. Only then it is that a discipline like economics can progress as long as it uses models. We think that it is descriptively accurate of a lot of modeling practices in contemporary economics. And although we think that, we of course don't think that all progress in economics is functional. Most likely not even all model-based economics is progressing in this way. But nevertheless, we still think that although, of course, the details have to be worked out, we still think that the functional account of progress is a fruitful way to think about model-based economics. And to conclude then, it's basically repeating a little bit what I just said. The practices in economics, in model-based economics, consist oftentimes of these repeated and reliable applications of model templates that are part of common recipes, and these model templates are integrated combinations of conceptual vision of the phenomenon to be modeled in a highly mathematical form that is needed for actually modeling them. That's what we at least observe in economics, as we do in all sorts of other fields, of course, that use mathematical modeling. Those model templates are applied and reapplied if economists consider them useful defined as Shan defines it. And then if economists share the conceptual vision underlying them, and those model templates are dismissed or replaced if the conceptual vision becomes questioned, and thereby progress is hampered. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This was great. Now we move to Uskali, who will provide his comments. Uskali, you have 10 to 15 minutes, and then we will move on to the QA session.
Okay. Now you can hear me, I suppose.
Yes, we can.
Great, great. Okay, thanks, Catherine. This was very, very inspiring. I feel very privileged by being in this position today, especially because of this very neglected topic in the philosophy of economics. I'm going to have a few rather tough questions. I apologize in advance, but hopefully some of them are based on some misunderstanding. Okay. Now, here is one issue that appears also in your paper. There are rival judgments about whether progress has occurred in economics or not. There are those who say that for the last 2 centuries or so, there has been no progress of any important sort, at least technical improvements and the like, whereas the theoretical vision has remained more or less unchanged. I mean, you cite Lucas, and then there are these heterodox economists, and they seem to be agreeing on this, but they draw very opposite conclusions. The heterodox blame mainstream economics for dogmatism, etc. And from the point of view of progress, I mean, this could be, at least the possibility should be considered that this is a case of stagnation or something like that, lack of progress. I mean, you say that most economists lack an interest in pursuing further theoretical progress. This may be correct, but what does this tell us about whether economics is progressive or lacks opportunities for making further progress, etc.? So I guess this gives rise to further interesting questions also for you. And then there are those who say that, yes, sure. I mean, if you ask a practicing economist and say that, hey, you haven't made any progress for the last 200 years, they say, sure, there has been a lot of it, especially recently. Theories, models, methods, data, whatever, all of them have improved. So this is a very contested issue, and I would imagine that the position one takes depends on the chosen level of abstraction, as it were. And I think this must be included in whatever comments the philosophers of economics make on this matter. So by the way, I've written in the red whatever questions I have for you. What's your view exactly? Is it closer to no or in between, and on what grounds, etc.? This might be too big for having actually a discussion on it because of the lack of time. Okay, progress in economics as a topic for philosophy of economics, I think it's important, and here we have a generational issue, I would I would say, in the philosophy of economics community. Those of us who have been around for somewhat longer do recollect that this was a major theme in the pre-field stage and the early days of the field of philosophy of economics, Popper, Kuhn, Loettgers, Loudon, etc. You actually, I would say, you mischaracterized the focus and the nature of progress that these guys and philosophers of economics applying these ideas to the study of economics had in mind. I would say it was mainly epistemic. It was not semantic, as you suggested. I mean, nobody, insofar as I can tell, applied the idea of verisimilitude to the study of economics. It was mainly about issues of justification and progress in terms of increased justification, etc. And also discontinuities in Kuhn's case and things like that. So it's not that verisimilitude was the notion that was adopted from Popper. It was falsification, falsifiability, and all the rest of it. And then of course, the modifications in Loettgers and so forth. Okay. So it's good to have different generations represented in the community, so the memory still functions. And surely now it's an under-examined topic, and this actually parallels the developments in philosophy of science. It's there has not been as much interest in progress as there was in the, say, 60s, 70s, and so forth. But it's restarting, it seems. But of course, in philosophy of economics, I mean, still there was this book that I told you about, Is There Progress in Economics, an edited volume, a pretty thick volume, 2002, that draws on an SHET conference organized in Graz, maybe the previous year. I was there too, so I do remember. But anyway, because of this lack of sufficient interest in issues of progress, I'm very happy that you have taken up this topic, and praise you for that. Okay, now I'm beginning my comments on because there was a paper, I've read the paper too. The title, Progress in Economics, it promises too much. I'm sure you're aware of this. It covers just a very small set of kinds of issues of scientific progress. And actually, I might even question whether it deals with progress seriously after all, but more on that in a moment. Okay, and it deals with and uses for illustration a very small fragment of economics. But this is no big problem. It's equally easy to meet this criticism by simply rephrasing the title to communicate the narrow focus. So this was not very serious at all. This might be a little bit more serious. The question is, what's new here? And because there is this general phenomenon, not just in philosophy of economics, but elsewhere too, that the same or similar issues are addressed using different terms and frameworks, sequentially or parallel to one another, without paying much critical attention to the other or previous attempts to address these issues. And this often means that cumulative progress in the philosophical study of economics is weaker than it could be otherwise. And there will be ever new fresh starts, as it were, as if no prior research has been done. There is, I mean, everybody recognizes this novelty fetish in not just in philosophy of economics, but all over the place in the academic world. And it's not just, you know, internally developed. It has some external conditions as well. But anyway, I started asking whether there is any of this in here. So what's new here? What's better? And especially, is there any progress here in thinking of progress? I think this is a worthwhile question to ask. The paper itself doesn't recognize such progress, it seems to me, because it doesn't recognize predecessors. So it's a paper in a historical vacuum, as it were. But the question that needs to be asked is that whether there are new and better ideas proposed here, or is it mostly old ideas newly named? This is a question. No claims made. Then the very phrase here, functional progress. I'm very puzzled by this this phrase itself. Now look at how you define progress. Progress involving the repeated use of model templates, and then you say it's best captured by the functional account of progress. I fail to see the sense of functional as an attribute of progress here. Why functional? I mean, there are these primitive terms here used, like usefulness, problem defining, problem solving, reuse, reapplication, and things like that. And I wonder if it would be better called pragmatic or something like that. I'm not even sure if that would be the best label for it. But if you look at Chan's 19 paper, progress as fulfillment of certain function, like this would be a justification for using this terminology of functional in front of progress. This idea of fulfillment of a certain function fails to distinguish any account separate from all other, this account separate from maybe all other accounts, the epistemic, the semantic, the noetic. All of them could be construed as suggesting that progress amounts to fulfillment of some functions. So I'm still looking for justification for this terminology. But concerning the substance here, my question is, where is progress? I mean, repeated use of model templates, why would that qualify as progress? And my suggestion is that some further conditions must be met. And then the question is, what are those further conditions? Of course, this thing happens. There is repeated use of model templates, etc. But in order for that to qualify as progress, some further conditions must be met. But let's then look at some of the key concepts here: usefulness, problem, and so forth. This is from slide number 14 in the longer version that you had sent to me. So maybe not the one that you presented. today. Problems and their solutions are useful if and only if they are addressed in a process that is repeatable, provides a reliable framework that is re-applicable. So if and only if, this is serious, I mean, it's so strong. So this actually implies that nothing short of meeting those two requirements is useful. And this would be very strongly against our ordinary notion of usefulness. So this is a very special and peculiar notion of usefulness. You just need to think of examples of things that we might find useful. Here is a structure that you might try to check if it would be useful for your purposes. Namely, we need to ask, useful for what? Usefulness is relational. So something is used for something else, and then something is when something is successfully used for something else, then we may say that this something is useful for is something else. This would be the most general way of articulating the notion of usefulness, and then we would need to leave behind your very strong if and only if claim said it above. Okay, then look at what Sean says in this 19 paper. Science progresses if more useful research problems and their corresponding solutions are proposed. Useful research problems. What are useful research problems? What are they useful for? I mean, we need to ask, what are they useful for? There needs to be something for which they are useful, otherwise they are not useful problems. Then these problems and solutions are proposed. Mere proposal would amount to progress. I'm not so sure. I mean, this would be strange because it would not require anything like acceptance or adoption by the scientific community. Just proposal would be enough for making progress. This cannot be the case. Also, the idea of more research problems and solutions, does this just denote a mere number, more than before or whatever, mere number? What about the importance of these problems? I mean, it can't be that just any problem can be counted regardless of their degree of importance. But generally, I think what's lacking here is some further reflection on what a problem is. What makes a problem a problem? There are a vast range of types of problems, and we need to ask which ones are relevant for science and for scientific progress. And maybe especially if we think that the progress in economics might be somewhat peculiar, different from progress in other fields, then what problems are relevant for progress in economics? These are questions that arise when reading both Sean and your paper. Then the idea of problem solution. This was, I mean, in the previous longer version of your slide number 15, but you also showed it as solution. This is a definition of a solution, or at least it says that the solution to a problem usually consists of the following components. So, and then there's a list of these components, but this seems to suggest that a solution to a problem has as its components the means for solving the problem. These listed things are among the means for solving the problem, but my puzzlement here is that I don't see any idea of what the solution is that is produced, generated by these means. So what is a solution? I think it's missing here. And of course, in order to answer that question, we need to have answered the prior question. of what is a problem, what makes a problem, and what kinds of problems there are, especially those that are worth the while of inquiry. And here I think is a very, very important observation that I think is missing in your paper. Progress is a normative notion. It's not just any change from an A to a B would qualify as progress, not just any reapplication of a template to a new domain or addressing a new problem, so providing a solution, etc., would qualify. For a change to qualify as progress, it must be judged to be good, desirable, advisable, etc. It must meet some normative standards. The change must be an improvement, and this was missing, insofar as I could tell. And here is, I think, a very, very big question for you. What's your normative standard? Because without it, you cannot have an account of scientific progress at all. And that's why I said that I'm not sure that you have provided an account of progress in economics, because your normative standard seems to be missing. Okay, and here we go. So if we look at science as problem setting and problem solving, and then develop a notion of progress in those terms, further questions arise, such as, is this all too trivial? Because all of science, all of human life involves setting and solving problems of many, many kinds. Okay, so what's the news here? And then once you recognize this vast range of problem-solving activities, then you might also recognize the possibility of regression, even if there is apparent progress in terms of setting and solving problems. Because you might set problems for yourself or for your research community that are easier to solve than previous. And previous problems were too difficult, so let's leave them behind and let's set easier problems for us to solve. And then we manage to solve them, and then you might say there is progress here. But this might actually be a matter of regression rather than progress, because you failed to solve the more difficult problem. Or you might just set problems for yourself and your community just for the sake of problem solving itself, and turning science into playing chess or playing games in general, with no further interest in anything but, hey, let's have a nice problem here and let's see how it can be solved, and that's it. Okay. So my idea here is that on top of problem solving, we need to ask what else is going on in science, and maybe in human life too. And so by means of setting and solving problems, what else might be pursued and attained in science? And here are the good old-fashioned ideas, maybe reliable knowledge, maybe discovery of new and unapparent facts, maybe some truths, maybe not the truth, maybe better explanations, improved understanding, and all those things that are covered by these alternative accounts of progress. Actually, my view is that problem solving must be eventually regulated and constrained by some such higher standards, if you wish, wherein problem solving then plays instrumental roles. Problem solving alone, just by itself, cannot be the key of progress. It may be an instrument that promotes progress, but progress does not amount to problem-solving successes. Okay, kinds of progress. Now, Humphreys, you cite Humphreys. Look at Humphreys. Templates and their reapplications to new domains. contribute to the acquisition of knowledge and understanding. G sounds like the progress in the sense of the epistemic account, knowledge, noetic account, understanding. And then there is this unificationist flavor here, repeated application of model templates to define and solve old and new problems. And here I think this is because of this idea of reuse and reapplication plays such a prominent role in this account. I think it only would matter of you to reflect on how this account relates to unificationism in the of older versions. I mean, those that are already in the market, as it were. And because these have already been examined in the context of economics, I mean, by myself and by me and Katarina Marchionni and so forth. It's nice to see how this idea of reapplication is related to the idea of explanatory unification, which has a very similar spirit, actually. So my question here is, might this help specify why repeated use of model templates can be considered progress? Might these ideas provide you with the normative standard of progress that could be associated with the idea of problem setting and problem solving? Well, here I just, this relates to the unificationist idea in your account. I mean, you have this idea of mathematical structure and conceptual vision. I mean, instances of a familiar general pattern sounds like ontological unification, my term, conveyed by this conceptual vision. And then we have Kitcher, Philip Kitcher, which is a bit more organized, or there are more elements in Kitcher's account of these semantic sentences, filling instructions, classification, etc., and stringency requirements, and all of this then can be used for unifying diverse exponenda after the unificatory accomplishment do not appear as diverse anymore. Okay, this is where my work and Katarina's might be relevant for. So there are these two frameworks, yours and Kitcher's. They seem similar, or at least somewhat related. And then would be interesting for you to check what the relations exactly are. Then you have this idea of mathematical structure and conceptual vision being in tension with one another. Here you envision this situation where this conceptual vision must be reshaped or shaped because a mathematical template having been accepted. So it's a conceptual vision that yields, and adjustments are being made in the conceptual vision under the pressure of the newly adopted mathematical template or something like that. Now, this would be interesting to compare with my work on a model and an ontological vision. The model is constrained by available formal and other resources, and an ontological vision that I call the way convictions about the way the world works, triple W. And here I envision, and I show some examples from the new microeconomics, in case there's a tension between these two, which looks like very similar to your tension between mathematical structure and conceptual vision. It's the ontological vision that pressures the formal model to undergo changes. So it's the reverse from your case. And then again, my question is, are these about roughly the same thing, or are they different? Well, maybe this is because I never bought Alexandrova and Northcott's ideas in that handbook paper, especially the criticism of the isolation by idealization account of models, etc. Here is just an example, my paper 2004 on how this can be used for when combined with the erotetic approach to progress conceived in terms of questions and answers of different kinds. And so new questions may arise, and that's already a possibility of a progress. And then when they are answered, you make another kind of progress. So this is the combination of the isolation by idealization framework with the erotetic framework of questions and answers. Again, it would be nice, of course, but to hear your views on this. But anyway, I've said too much already, and as I promised, some of the questions might be tough, but I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Thanks, Uskali. Catherine, would you like to respond?
So yeah, sure. That was a lot. Maybe I start. So I try to follow and write down the points that you made. I might forget one or two, but let me start by, before I go into them, by saying how the paper came about, because it is a bit misleading to take the paper to fully represent my views, in the sense that in this paper, so we were supposed to write a very, very short handbook introduction into progress in economics. And of course there is, this is very constraining. And so we focused on this very specific aspect of what we think might be interesting to think about, namely this functional account. And although it almost it does almost or it does not engage with almost any literature because there was no space, we try to stay as broad as possible by saying, well, economics is a science that uses mathematical models. And I think almost everything in economics is more or less related to using mathematical models. That's why, you might think it's a little bit broader than you now sketched it. It's not like this tiny little fraction, I think, but we can discuss this. So in the moment where you want to think about model-based economics as progressive, we thought, okay, what are the kinds of accounts of models that would help us to think about this? And the idea that we took up, and of course that's also Marcel's background, is this idea by Mary Morgan and Morrison, namely models as mediators, having this autonomous status. And in that, once you take this idea up, it constrains you a little bit, in the sense that a lot of what you just mentioned, the literature that is out there, including by yourself and by Katharina, is a literature that mainly thinks of models in a very specific way, namely as, representational, and in heavily relying, or in some way very closely related to scientific theories. So if you talk about the unificationist approach, of course, you talk about theories, basically. And so we wanted to, we thought of focusing in this chapter mainly on thinking about those kinds of, or those practices in economics that are not about using theory primarily. So maybe you can see it as a more complementary way, rather than something that is meant to replace these views. Maybe we should have been more explicit in the chapter, and we tried to do that a little bit, but it was, I don't know, 6,000 words or so. It was very hard to actually, because you said also it's ahistorical. There's no way in which we engage in the history of in the philosophy of science of progress and how it has been debated. That's just a matter of space, to be honest. So now going through the points that you made. First of all, or let me say this. Once you take up this idea of models as mediators and a very practice-based approach, of course, an internalist account of progress becomes attractive, because you mentioned a lot about, that there is a normative standard missing by which you can measure when something is actually progressive and so forth, and I agree. But the problem with the functional internalist approach is that it takes the standards from the scientists. So in that sense, a problem is solved in a useful way if it is, and you asked for what, for being or for helping scientists to fulfill the function of their field. That's why it's called functional. It's called functional because the idea here is that science progresses in the moment where it can actually fulfill its functions. And if you help solving problems in a certain way that science can reach this goal of fulfilling its functions, then this is considered to be progressive. But of course, you take all the normative standards from the scientists themselves, because they say what the functions of their field is. They say when a problem has been usefully solved in order to fulfill these functions, and so forth. Now, you can say, well, you don't have to. You can also come up with your own normative standards. That would be something that we would ultimately do. I'm not sure whether Marcel and I am going to work further on this together, but certainly that's something that I would want to think about further. As I said, my thinking on this is at the very beginning, but on the functionalist account, it's taken from the scientists. Now, this is the point that relates to what you said. Is it then trivial? Maybe. And also, is it maybe not progressing, but rather is it regressing? In the moment where you take the standards by the scientists and the problems and the solutions, and how do you evaluate them from the scientists, then you might also run into a community that that sets themselves very low standards, might set themselves to solve very simple problems. And here I take this point that it might become difficult to some degree to talk of these developments in terms of progress. But this is something I would like to think further about. The way in which we thought of focusing mainly on problems is, I don't think this is unusual, is that since Kuhn, of course, there's a lot of, the latest, there's a lot of this thinking that, well, it's mainly problems. So that's what scientists are doing. And then you mentioned what kind of problems are they after? Of course, that's something that we need to specify further. But the idea was just in this paper to say, well, it's at least broader than engineering problems or the kind of technical progress that Lucas talks about. But I agree that we have to say something about what these problems are and not just take them for granted from the scientists in order to meaningfully talk about progress, specifically in economics. So you said, let me just also engage with this point about this is not new. This is all old stuff in new bottles, so to say. That might be to some degree true, but I think the novelty comes in the concepts that are used, in the sense that there has been this tendency in general philosophy of science, and more broadly, that it is very hard to come up with the notion or the concept of scientific progress for every field. So it is an attempt to say something more specific about economics. And the most general account that is available, that is as generic, sufficiently generic to do that, and then requires further specification, I think is the functionalist account. So I think it's not completely, it's not old wine in new bottles, but rather it takes the idea seriously that we should focus more on specific disciplinary developments when thinking about these very broad questions. But maybe to leave it this, a little bit time for other people to ask questions, I maybe should stop here. And Uskali, we can engage on this further if you want, in some other occasion. Emra, would that be a good idea? I feel like otherwise we just talk too much.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. We used our time already, so let's switch to the Q&A session. But before that, I just want to thank you, Catherine, and thank Uskali for agreeing to give this talk and for being a discussant. And I would like to thank our team for making all these seminars possible. Now, thanks to all our audience for being here. And now we can stop the recording and move to the question and answer part of this seminar.